Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:08 p.m. in a very dark, inhospitable Budapest, where spring keeps threatening to make a breakthrough, but is continually destroyed by more powerful forces. And so the chills of winter are still with us. However, on a brighter note, thank you everybody who has joined me. And I hope that for once my microphone is working. If for any reason my microphone isn't working, do please let me know, because I don't want to go on and on and on, and then everybody tells me that Alexander Marinov says George kind of looks like Beethoven. Oh, that's nice. That's that's a nice way to start the evening. Thank you, thank you. Sounds good, says Robert. Okay, hi Robert, good to see you. Okay, so the big news of the day. I mean, there are two big things that we're going to talk about. There was the meeting in the White House today with the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, and he was with Trump, and it was a quite extraordinary spectacle because they really were engaged in what seemed like a in so Ivan Grozny says, George, congratulations on being right. I like this. Always congratulations on being right about the ceasefire prediction. Yes, well, we'll talk about that. Thank you, Ivan. So there was the love fest between Trump and Mark Rutte. They got on really like a house on fire, and Rutte continually praised Trump for having done so much for NATO, for having pressed NATO in countries into upping the ante, in contributing more to the common fund. And S.A. Denendam says Beethoven is the first liberal. I guess so. I mean, yeah, it was he composed the Eroica Symphony and dedicated it to Napoleon. And then Napoleon declared himself to be emperor, and he withdrew the dedication, and it left it as to the memory of a great man. So yeah, he was the first anti-imperialist. Well, I think there were others, but he somehow was perhaps among the most famous of the anti-imperialists. So and it's very interesting because we've had all this nonsense, day after day, week after week, month after month, of this ridiculous, absolute phony, baloney, fraudulent nonsense coming from the mainstream media that suggested that Trump wanted to leave NATO. Trump and NATO are at loggerheads. That it's now a battle to the death. Trump hates NATO. Trump, is determined to abandon NATO. America's going to go its own way. Europe is going to go its own way. Europe has to look after its own defense, and they can't rely on NATO anymore. Just watch the two of them together and see what absolutely phony, ridiculous nonsense. And it's very striking that for somebody who's supposedly so anti-NATO as Trump is alleged to be, he has made sure, or at least that's what Trump claims, and that's what Rutte claims. Trump has made sure that all NATO member states are now contributing far more to the common NATO fund than they were before. Now, that's not something you do if you hate NATO, if you intend to walk away from NATO. You don't do that. Because, of course, there is never the slightest chance. There was never the slightest chance at all of the United States walking away from NATO. And I've gone through the history many times here, and other places, saying, we've gone through so many of these transatlantic spats over the years, and every time we do this, there's always the hysterical worrywarts. Usually they're to be found in Europe, but for some reason it's because of it's Trump. Now it's to be found in the United States, claiming that America will withdraw from NATO. And the Europeans, oh no, America's going to withdraw from, they're going to abandon us, they're going to abandon us. And every time the Europeans do this, the Americans step in and say, well, what can we do to reassure you? And whatever the Europeans say we can do to reassure you, the Americans always do it. And so the first time this really happened was in the 1950s with this goes back a long way, with the European defense community. The Americans came up with this idea of France and Germany pooling their armies together, because of the Soviet threat. This is around 1953. And so the French and the Germans would pool their armies together. This would be the European defense community. At the time, West Germany, as it was then known, was not a member of NATO, because when nobody really wanted West Germany in. And so they had a referendum in France, and the French said, well, we don't want to form a common army with the Germans. We don't want this European defense community. And that's what John Foster Dulles famously said, well, now time for an agonizing reappraisal. We just may have to abandon Europe. And lo and behold, they came up with a better solution. West Germany was inducted into NATO. And so therefore the whole storm in a teacup over the European defense community was just that, a storm in a teacup. Everyone's already forgotten about it because West Germany was inducted into NATO. And that's really what was always what it was about. And then, of course, we had the 1960s, when suddenly everyone got very worried. In Europe, they got very worried. Oh, God, now the Americans are not going to sacrifice New York and Boston for Bonn and Dusseldorf. The nuclear deterrent has no validity. There's no credibility. There's no credibility. There's no credibility. Of course, it was such a stupid argument because, of course, as long as the nuclear weapons are there, no one's going to start messing around and thinking, well, will they use them or won't they use them? Well, I don't think they'll use them. So let's just invade Europe because we know the Americans aren't going to use them. But nonetheless, this was a kind of hysteria on the part of the Europeans in the early 1960s about the lack of credibility of the American nuclear guarantee. And so the Americans, thought, well, how can we reassure the Europeans? So they came up with this idea of deploying their missiles in Europe. And so they came up with the idea of deploying the Jupiter missile in Italy and in Turkey. But in doing so, of course, they infuriated the Russians because now Americans now had nuclear tipped missiles really on their borders. And this caused great anguish in Moscow, and maybe they reassured the Europeans, but they caused great anguish in Moscow, and that of course led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Soviets reciprocated and said, well, if you're going to put Jupiter missiles on our borders in Turkey, we're going to put them on your borders in Cuba. So that was the great crisis of transatlantic relations. And then, of course, in the 1980s, it was again nuclear weapons, and again the Europeans were anxious that the Americans are abandoning them. And at that time, the issue was this détente. So what's happening is that because of this détente, the Americans are entering into all these strategic arms agreements with the Soviet Union, all those SALT agreements, but they are neglecting the Soviet missile buildup in Europe. Now, of course, there was no Soviet missile buildup in Europe. There were intermediate range missiles stationed in the west of Russia, but they were never actually in Eastern Europe. I mean, people repeatedly get this wrong and saying that somehow the Soviets deployed their SS-20 missiles in Eastern Europe. They never did that. They did deployment in Western Russia, but not in Eastern Europe. Anyway, it caused a lot of panic, and therefore we had to. So it's very strange. I'm looking at the. Oh, yeah, okay. Now, well, it's still very strange. In terms of the numbers, I'm getting very strange numbers. Anyway, um, but what then happened is that because of this European panic, again, we're being decoupled. There's a called decoupling. That somehow, because the Soviets have these intermediate range missiles, the Soviets can contemplate launching an attack against us, and in the knowledge that the Americans are not going to use their intercontinental range missiles. And lo and behold, therefore, the only way the Americans could reassure the European warlords was to deploy intermediate range missiles in Europe, stationed in Europe, so that if by any chance the Soviets were to launch these intermediate range missiles, we have these missiles here, right here, physically in Europe. Therefore, the deterrent is as credible as ever. And that, of course, led to the big Euro missile crisis of the 1980s. The reason I bring up all this ancient history is that we've been here so many times before, and there is no way, never, never, never will Europe and the United States go their separate ways, because NATO serves American purposes very, very, very nicely. It's through its domination of the European continent, this extremely wealthy European continent, a strategically located European continent, through its domination of that, does the United States get to be a global power. It doesn't have that in Asia. It doesn't have anything comparable to NATO in Asia. It has its allies in Asia, but it has nothing comparable to NATO. And that's how America gets to be the global power. It can project power from Europe into the Middle East, which it does on a regular basis. It can project power into Africa, which it does so on a regular basis. And it can use its presence in Europe to project power into Western Asia, which it does on a regular basis. So the idea that it's just going to abandon, we'll abandon Ramstein. Yeah, we don't need Ramstein. Yeah. We'll abandon all these bases in the Black Sea. Yeah, we don't need that. We'll abandon all our bases in the Baltic. No, we don't need that. Of course, they're not going to do it. This is a fraudulent, absolute fraud that has been perpetrated by the mainstream media, which somehow tell us that Trump really hates Europe, hates NATO. But Trump doesn't hate Europe. Trump doesn't hate NATO. All Trump does is a landlord. And what do landlords do? They go harassing their tenants, asking them to cough up their rent money. That's what they do. They bang on your door and say, you're in arrears. You better pay up or you're evicted. That's Trump's mentality. And of course, for the Europeans, NATO is extremely useful, because they don't really pay very much. I mean, even though they're paying a lot more now and they're threatening to pay a lot more in the future, it's still nothing really. And it's what enables the Europeans to enjoy their very comfortable lifestyles, their 6-week vacations, their cradle to grave welfare, all those, guaranteed unemployment benefits, universal health care. I mean, you name it. The Europeans enjoy all of that. They have a very nice standard of life, and the price they pay is they lose their freedom. Well, okay, they want a life of comfort, and then that they become dependent on the United States. But what do people who are dependent do? Well, they start panicking at various times, thinking that somebody, the person on whom they are dependent, will one day cut the cord and say, you're on your own. But it's never going to happen. And it's ridiculous and an insult to our intelligence that we go through this every few years. And in the case of Trump, we've been doing this now really since 2015, pretending to believe that the United States has the slightest intention of withdrawing from NATO. Just watch the two of them. Watch Mark Rutte and Trump today. How they flattered each other and were paying compliments to each other, and both of them praising how much Trump has done to strengthen NATO, and Rutte reminded Trump, as if Trump needed reminding, is that, well, it was you who sent Mr. President, you who sent the javelins to Ukraine. Yes. Now that you mention it, yeah, I did send the javelins. I sent lethal weapons to Ukraine, and that made all the difference to Ukraine. Whereas Obama, the great internationalist, the great champion of NATO, I guess, he only sent blankets and pillows. So that's all nonsense. But it's very funny that on this, and on the issue of the ceasefire, which we'll now come to, the mainstream media and CNN are on the same page, because CNN is also peddling this nonsense that that Europe and the United States are going to go their separate ways. It's not going to happen, but they're still peddling this. So that's that. So and then now the other thing was, of course, that we had on Tuesday, just before we started the live stream, we had the announcement from Jeddah in Saudi Arabia that the Americans had put forward a proposal for a 30-day ceasefire, and Ukraine had accepted this, and that now this was going to be presented to the Russians, and of course all of the sort of, again, the Ukraine champions were delighted by this, because now we have wrong-footed Putin, because Putin is bound to say no, and so they all the Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas and Boris Johnson, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, all of the usual suspects, they all sent out the same tweet or X, insisting that the ball is now in Russia's court, because now they were assuming that Russia will say no, and they said, well, now we've wrong-footed Russia. We've shown that Russia is the enemy of peace. That it's Russia that's preventing a possible settlement of this conflict. And now, with this absolutely open evidence of Russia's warlike comportment, with that, Trump will be able to turn around and hit Russia really hard with sanctions. So that's why that was all. They all sent out that tweet. The ball is in Russia's court. The ball is in Russia's court. Then again, we had CNN saying something very similar, which is Russia will say no. Russia will absolutely reject this 30-day ceasefire. Russia will never, never, never accept this. Now, even at that moment on Tuesday evening, it occurred to me that that isn't Russia's style. Russia does not say no, right? That Russia has always shown itself to be very amenable to negotiations. That Russia has now spoken very highly, very respectfully about Trump and his people, and saying, well, with Trump, we now have a different team in charge in Washington. We have a responsible, mature people that we can do business with, people who see the world the way we do. So it was never in the slightest bit plausible that Russia was going to say no, because then Russia would be insulting Trump, and therefore they would be certainly provoking Trump into taking harsh measures. Russia does not want to do that. And so it was clear that that's not how Russia would respond. Now, that doesn't mean that Russia was simply going to accept the ceasefire proposal as presented, because, of course, that ceasefire proposal was highly detrimental to Russia's interests, because it went together with the Americans declaring that the arms stop, the arms deliveries to Ukraine will be resumed, and intelligence sharing will be resumed. So as things stood when this ceasefire proposal was presented, that was very detrimental to Russia, because therefore for 30 days, the arms flows would continue to unabated to Ukraine. Intelligence would continue to be delivered to Ukraine. And the Europeans, and particularly the French, were already chomping at the bit, declaring that they were going to send in their peacekeepers. And so, the Europeans were not in any way bound by anything, because they said, well, this was an agreement between the Americans and the Ukrainians, and whatever Russia agrees or doesn't agree, it doesn't affect us. So we intend to send in our peacekeepers. And so this was obviously not at all to Russia's advantage, and obviously Russia wasn't going to tolerate that. And of course, the Europeans have no interest in any ceasefire. They want this war to continue. That's been their line all along. It's been the line of the Biden administration throughout the years of this war, and they obviously wanted this to go on. So when they present their demand, or their insistence that they intend to send their peacekeepers in right away, not even, oh well, when everything is settled, we're going to do this. No, they said right away, we are going to send in our peacekeepers. In other words, immediately, as soon as the ceasefire is put in place, we're going to start building kind of NATO infrastructure in Ukraine. They're outright saying it. This French foreign minister was pretty much outright saying it, something that was obviously the Russians couldn't possibly accept, because this was the origin of this war. So it was clear to me that the Russians were, first of all, not going to say no. They weren't going to show Trump the back of their hand. They were going to show Trump respect, but they couldn't accept the ceasefire proposal as delivered. I mean, if the Secretary of State Marco Rubio had said, okay, we have a ceasefire, and at the same time, the stoppage on arms deliveries to Ukraine will continue, and there'll be no further intelligence sharing, then that would be, that's all right. The Russians would have to take that seriously. But I mean, if you say, well, we're going to send arms in during those 30 days, strengthen Ukraine, help Ukraine build up their fortifications, so that when the fighting resumes, they're in a much stronger position than they are currently, then obviously that would not be acceptable. So it was clear that what the Russians would do would be to be very polite towards the Americans, very respectful, and they say we're taking it all very seriously. However, we would definitely want to see some amends, or some not amends, but some changes to it. And that's in fact exactly what happened today. So we had this we had an advisor to Putin saying, expressing some skepticism about it, which of course was seized on by the media, saying, Putin has flatly rejected the ceasefire proposal. He didn't say that. I think his name is Uvashov. Yeah, Uvashov. But that's not what Uvashov said. He was misquoted in the media. He just said, as the plan is at the moment, then that would just simply be a breathing space for Ukraine. But he didn't say that Russia was flatly rejecting this. But then later on, Putin, he met President Lukashenko of Belarus, and then they held a joint news conference, and there he spoke in some more detail about the ceasefire plan. And I want to go through what he actually said during that news conference. Can I have it here? All right, so hope everyone can see it. So here was the question. Play. The question was, how do you assess Ukraine's readiness for a ceasefire? Have you already received information from the Americans, and what will be your answer? And then Putin says, regarding Ukraine's readiness for a ceasefire, I will of course say how I assess this. But first of all, I would like to begin with words of gratitude to the President of the United States, Mr. Trump, for devoting so much attention to the settlement in Ukraine. So notice exactly, he's not going to show him the back of the hand. He would show him due respect. He's not, say, thank you very much, Mr. President, for devoting so much attention to the settlement in Ukraine. We all have enough of our own current affairs, but many leaders of states and the chairman of the People's Republic of China, the Prime Minister of India, the presidents of Brazil and South Africa are working on this issue and devoting a lot of time to it. And we are grateful to all of them for this because this activity is aimed at achieving a noble mission, the mission of ending hostilities and human losses. Second, we agree with the proposals to cease hostilities, but we proceed from the fact that this cessation should be such that it would lead to a long-term peace and eliminate the initial causes of this crisis. So he says here, we agree with this proposal, but it has to be a stage toward the final settlement. By itself, a kind of a ceasefire makes little sense. And then to eliminate the initial cause of the crisis. And then now regarding Ukraine's readiness to cease hostilities, the American-Ukrainian meeting in Saudi Arabia may outwardly look like a decision made by the Ukrainian side under American pressure. In fact, I'm absolutely convinced that the Ukrainian side should have asked the Americans for this in the most insistent manner based on the situation that is developing, as was just said here on the ground. So what he's saying here, it's not exactly clear, but what he's saying is that, well, it seems like it was the Americans who applied the pressure on the Ukrainians to accept this, but in reality, because the battlefield is going so badly for Ukraine, it's the Ukrainians, who are really insisting on a ceasefire. They need the respite from the disastrous course that the war is taking. That's what he's saying here. And how is it going? Surely many have noticed that yesterday I was in the Kursk region and listened to reports from the chief of the general staff, the commander in the North Group, and his deputy regarding the situation in the border area, primarily in the Kursk region. So that was, we saw that yesterday. He was wearing army fatigues to show his militarism. Not very impressive, to be honest, because Putin is not a wartime leader. I mean, he has his strengths, but being a wartime leader is not one of them. I mean, he's a technocrat. He's a peacetime leader. He's much happier talking about oil and gas and spending on infrastructure projects and so on. But wartime leader, he's not. Anyway, but he was wearing his fatigues in that meeting in Kursk, and it was his first visit to the Kursk region since the August the 7th incursion last year. So what is happening there, he asks? The situation there is completely under our control, and the group that invaded our territory is isolated. This is complete isolation and complete fire control. Control of the Ukrainian troops inside this invasion zone has been lost, and if at the first stages, literally a week or two ago, Ukrainian servicemen tried to leave there in small groups, now this is impossible. They are trying to leave there in very small groups, 2 or 3 people, because everything is under our complete fire control. So basically, we've got them surrounded, and they're not able to retreat. And then the equipment has been completely abandoned. It's impossible to remove it. It will remain there. This is already guaranteed. And if a physical blockade occurs in the coming days, then no one will be able to leave at all. There will be only 2 options: surrender or die. And in these conditions, it seems to me it would be very good for the Ukrainian side to achieve a ceasefire for at least 30 days. And we are for it, but there are nuances. What are they? So saying, the Ukrainians are kind of stuck in this situation in Kursk and would very much like a ceasefire so they can get themselves out of this jam that they find themselves in Kursk, and basically to withdraw, which we're not going to just allow just like that, in exchange for nothing. And then first, what are we going to do with this section of the penetration into the Kursk region? If we stop military action for 30 days, what does that mean? That everyone who is there will leave without a fight? Should we let them out of there after all they have committed, a lot of crimes against civilians? Or will the Ukrainian leadership give them the order to lay down their arms and simply surrender? How will that happen? So you can see what he's doing here. He's saying, okay, we can go for a 30-day ceasefire, but we're not just going to allow the Ukrainians to just withdraw just like that. They can, because basically they invaded our country. You don't just get to walk out without paying a price. So he's saying that we might be tempted for the ceasefire, but they will have to surrender. We're not just going to allow them to withdraw back into Ukraine. They would have to surrender. That's what it said. That everyone who is there will leave without a fight. Should we let them out of there after they have committed a lot of crimes against civilians? Or will the Ukrainian leadership give them the order to lay down their arms and simply surrender? How will that happen? It's unclear. And how will other issues be resolved along this entire contact line? And that is almost 2,000 kilometers. And there, as you know, Russian troops are advancing in almost all areas of combat contact. And there, too, conditions are being created for us to blockade entire, fairly large units. So, how will these 30 days be used to continue forced mobilization in Ukraine, to supply weapons there, to train newly mobilized units, or will none of this be done? Then the question arises, how will the issue of control and verification be resolved? How can we and how will we be guaranteed that nothing like this will happen? How will control be organized? I hope that at the level of common sense, this is clear to everyone. These are all serious questions. And who will give orders to cease hostilities? And what is the price of these orders? Can you imagine almost 2,000 kilometers? Yeah. Who will determine where and who violated a possible agreement on a ceasefire over a distance of 2,000 kilometers? And then who will blame whom for this violation, for the violation of this agreement? These are all questions that require painstaking research from both sides. Therefore, the idea itself is correct, and we certainly support it, but there are questions that we must discuss. I think that we need to talk to our American colleagues and partners about this. Colleagues and partners, note this language. American colleagues and partners about this. Maybe call President Trump and discuss it together, but we support the idea of ending this conflict by peaceful means. So you can see here what he's doing. He's really saying you got a number of issues. You've got the situation in Kursk that needs to be addressed, and then you got the situation in along the 2,000 kilometers of the then 2,000 kilometers of the contact line. Each of these the issues are quite complicated. Now, at the moment, we have the Steve Witkoff, who is in Moscow, and I think they're having a meeting today. But you can see that this is going to be taken seriously. The Russians are going to take this very seriously, and they are presenting a situation. They're telling them that these are our conditions, and we're not just going to sit down and accept a 30-day ceasefire, but in principle we will do so. But at a minimum, you have to stop sending the weapons into Ukraine. You're going to have to stop. You're not going to use this time in order to strengthen Ukraine. So then the whole thing starts up again in 30 days. So there has to be guarantees that you're not going to use this period to strengthen Ukraine at our expense. Then there has to, which means there's going to be no talk at all of European peacekeepers coming into the country, which is what the Europeans are rushing into. There's absolutely no basis for that. And you can't use this time to send arms and provide intelligence. This is reasonable, and of course, then the issue of Kursk, which it's hard to tell how that's going, but it does look like the Ukrainian position is collapsing. Is the and so that could just simply be resolved just like that. It could be willy nilly. That can just be resolved if the Ukrainian position does indeed collapse inside Kursk, and so at least that issue will be will stop being a hindrance. Trump, during his news conference with Mark Rutte, said, well, the Russian response has been very promising. So Trump sees this as very promising. Now, what I think is very important to keep in mind, that there is still a very good chance that there will be a ceasefire. And I know that that this is, everyone's going, no, 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 no. Putin's going to say no, absolutely rejected. No, no, no ceasefire. Look, Russia, like any other power, thinks in the long term, and he may well think that it's to Russia's advantage to maintain good relations with the United States. If that's a real possibility, if that's that's available. If the 30-day ceasefire is used by NATO and the United States to strengthen Ukraine against Russia, so that the whole thing just starts up again once the 30 days are over, or maybe extended for another 30 days or another 30 days, and then we start it all up again. So they've used the 90 days to do some serious strengthening and fortifying of Ukraine, then obviously that is not to Russia's interest, and therefore Russia would not do so. However, what matters here is you want to have a flexibility and show that you are ready to talk seriously. And above all, because you have an American president who is quite sympathetic to your position, quite open to normalizing relations with you, then you want to show him that you're ready to talk seriously. And this is why I brought up the other day the issue of Israel. What does Israel do very, very skillfully? It uses its the various ceasefires. It's managed to persuade the world that Israel is interested in peace. I mean, it's a brilliant maneuver. They've managed to persuade the world that they're interested in peace, and that the Palestinians are not interested in peace. The Arabs are not interested in peace, but Israel is interested in peace. One of the ways you do that is by pretending to be interested in ceasefires. Now, do they use the ceasefire in order to gain unilateral advantages over their adversaries? Yeah, probably. But that's kind of what you do. I mean, you have to make up your mind. What do you want to do in this world? I mean, you want to be a great power advancing your interests, or do you want to present yourself as being too good for this world? You're too saintly. You can't heaven forbid that you ever break your word. So I don't see any reason why Russia cannot say, okay, well, we're interested in a ceasefire, but you cannot use the period of the ceasefire to strengthen your position, and you cannot. And then, of course, they have to decide on Kursk. You know, Putin just threw up a set of ideas there on Kursk, whether he's going to allow withdrawal, which he doesn't seem at all keen on, or whether Zelensky will order a surrender. I don't know, but clearly a ceasefire would only apply to Ukraine. So it's just on the territory of Ukraine. It wouldn't apply to the territory of Russia. Um, so again, you know, it doesn't seem like if in those circumstances you really lose anything very much if the 30-day ceasefire is used to explore whether people are actually the other side is interested in a final settlement. Now, this is where it gets kind of ridiculous, again with the whole all the champions of Russia, is that in the past Russia has been extraordinarily amenable to agreements. That's what Russia does. Russia, is always negotiating. Russia always comes to deals which are not at all to Russia's advantage. So why would this be any different? I mean, if Russia agreed in February 2014 to essentially Yanukovych surrendering to the opposition by force, and then Russia agreed to the Minsk Accords, and then Russia agreed to the Istanbul agreement. At each point, Russia was ready to negotiate and agree. I mean, Istanbul, they withdrew. The Russians withdrew from Kiev. Or, apparently because Russia wanted to show good faith. Okay, that's fine. I mean, that if you want to do that, but then you have to ask, if you were prepared to do all of those things in the past, why aren't you prepared to do this now? And particularly when there is at least some possibility of a working partnership with the Americans. Now, what's the alternative? Let's say Russia says no. And I thought, just a maverick. I have to say, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice. But the point is that the story of Russia's relations with the West was not just fool me once, shame on you. It's not being fool me once, fool me twice, fool me three times, fool me four times, fool me five. It's about fool me time and time and time again. So if Russia has gone down this path many times before, then why now all of a sudden you're not going to do it, when if you can get some kind of a commitment from the West that they wouldn't use this period to gain unilateral advantages, and that they would negotiate seriously, it's just a 30-day ceasefire. It's not the end of the world. Nothing is going to be settled. It's just 30 days. Now, the alternative is to say no, flatly reject the American proposal, which is what everybody here maybe, and on YouTube and everywhere else, the people who denounce me and say, no, Russia's just going to march on. Okay, if you do go down that path, then you're basically going to have the Americans and the Europeans will join forces. The whole slight separation that has occurred, that will disappear, and Trump is going to escalate America's involvement in Ukraine. Trump is also going to escalate the sanctions. You're going to, exacerbate the sanctions. Now, some people say, okay, well, so what? Let him do that. Let him do his worst. That's a possibility. However, I don't think that's what Russia wants to do, because that essentially seals the deal. That, in other words, in that Russia can then grind on fighting, continually suffering casualties, and just grind on with this war, gaining I don't know how many square feet a day, and just go on grinding it out, while its relations with the West will be just ended once and for all. Trump was really the best hope Russia had for some kind of a rapprochement with the West. There's no if Trump were to fail, no one's going to try it again. Then whoever comes after say, well, hey, Trump did it. Trump, who has obviously been quite open and friendly and respectful towards the Russians for many years. So if Trump did it and Trump failed, and Trump after this initial feelers that he put out to Moscow, that failed, and then Trump reverted to essentially the Biden policy. Trump reverted to the Kaya Kallas, Ursula von der Leyen policy, and you say, okay, well, that's it. We tried it, and that failed. So Russia then goes on with its grinding war, which could go on for quite some time. I don't know how long it can go on for, but it could go on for some time. But its relations with the West will be irrevocably broken. I don't know whether that's necessarily what the Russian leadership wants. It's clear that the West is very important to the Russian leaders. And how do we know that? Well, because that's where they park their money. That's how we know that the West is important to them. They park their money in the West. Their children, the children of the Russian elite, they live in the West. They go to school in the West. They own houses, yachts in the West. Russians like to shop in the West. They want to go to Paris. They want to buy their Hermes bags and Louis Vuitton in the West. So if there was to be this irrevocable break between Russia and the West, I don't think this would go down very well among Russia's elite, and I don't think it would go down very well in the among the Russian public. I mean, it can be done. I mean, I don't doubt that it can be done, and they can say, well, we're only interested in China and India and so on. But then, of course, Russia becomes completely dependent upon China, and I don't think Russia wants to do that. I think Russia wants to, as any state would want to do, you want to have options. It wants to have flexibility. It wants to be able to have good relations with China, but it wants to have this opening to the West. Because again, where do Russians want to go on their vacations? I don't think they want to go to China and Vietnam. I think they'd like to go to Paris and London and Rome and such places. So I'm not buying, and I've never bought into the idea that Russia can just simply absolutely break its ties with the West, and that we've got the global South, and we've got all these all our friends in the East. I just don't think that's really where Russia wants to go. And above all, if it were to go down that path, it would have to admit that the post-Soviet era would have been a failure. I mean, the whole point of the ending the Soviet Union was that this artificial isolation from the West would come to an end. I mean, this is what the various intellectuals and the people in the party and everybody else, why they were so unhappy in the Soviet Union. It wasn't so much because of the material um, shortages, which there were, but that wasn't really the key. What matters what mattered to them was that they were isolated from the West. They could, this was the Soviet Union was largely an autarkic system. It didn't have any real economic ties to anyone other than their satellite states in Eastern Europe, which now they don't even have. They don't even have that option anymore. So so that's why I don't think um, that's what Russia wants to do. I don't think Russia wants to cut its ties with the West. And if there's a way that they can work something out with Trump um, and basically cut their losses. I mean, you could say, yeah, they've sacrificed a great deal in Ukraine. They've lost heavily, but then this is the case of the sunken cost fallacy, where you just keep doing it. I mean, and just keep doing it and doing it and doing it, and then keep suffering more and more casualties. Um, whereas there could be an option in saying, look, we're going to take something from Ukraine. Russia will take something from Ukraine. I mean, they've got Crimea, that's theirs. They will have a big chunk of Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Zaporozhye, not all of it, but some of it. So they have a buffer zone. They got something. They couldn't get everything. Then, so the option is, well, can we go on? Do we want to go on fighting in order to get everything? Well, if you're a Russian leader, that could be an option. Yeah, we want to go on fighting. We're going to get everything. We're going to wipe the floor with Ukraine. We have to march into Kiev, remove all the banderistas, remove all the Nazis, impose our own will, and that's all we're going to do. And then we'll force a capitulation from NATO. Well, that's to me, that's kind of wishful thinking. I think Russia's quite away from that, and in the process of trying to get that, they risk cutting themselves off entirely from the West, and so that's why you'd have to say the Russian leaders are going to have to make a serious decision. Now, going back to the 30-day ceasefire, as it stands, no. I mean, it's not acceptable to Russians. No, there's no way that Putin or any Russian leader can accept what this, because they're you got a 30-day ceasefire, and the and the Americans continue to deliver arms to Ukraine. That there's no way. That's not on. So there have to be some changes made, and I guess they're going to negotiate that with Steve Witkoff, and then but ultimately with Trump, and then Trump would then have to see that as this offer that he's presented is not an offer that Russia can possibly accept. But as I said, on Tuesday, I didn't think that the Russians were just simply going to say no. I think they're going to see if they can work something out with Trump. Anyway, let's take a look at our locals page and see what the people who matter, the people who deliver funds for the dogs, that matter. You can see there's not a great deal in the tip jar. kind of more or less more or less empty. So the dogs really won't be very happy. But all right. Anyway, so see here. There's a picture of Mark Rutte, and then Marty. Always good to see you, Marty. Thanks for all your postings. Really appreciate them, and he posted a lot of very interesting old footage from the BBC about London, and where the on the page where you vote for which film you want to see screened next Monday. Marty has posted some really interesting old documentaries from the BBC going back to the 1950s and 60s. Anyway, so there's a picture of Mark Rutte. Well, that looks pretty hideous. Tip jar, what tip jar? Yes. Well, yeah, the tip jar, yeah, that kind of needs attending to. And then Ivan Grozny, always good to see you. And then Marty says, Happy Thursday, George and Gagglers. And then Marx 2023 says, Tariffs are going well for Trump. The dollar is falling, leading to higher prices, which is all inflationary. Well, I wouldn't write it off yet. I think that it's as it's you never want to jump to conclusions right away. Tariffs are not inflationary. I've said this before. Tariffs are are a means of adjustment. It's about protecting your domestic producers. So all tariffs do is they tax importers. So certain prices will go up, not necessarily all of them, because it depends on whether the importers will want to pass on the tariffs onto the consumers. In some cases they will, in some cases they won't, but other prices will not go up. I mean, if you're a domestic producer, why would you want to raise your prices? On the contrary, you want to ensure and seize the moment that because your products are now competitive. So if you hit let's say champagne, which is what Trump is doing, hit the champagne with tariffs, then what does it do? Well, champagne prices in America go up. However, domestic producers of sparkling wines will suddenly find their sales increase because suddenly people think, well, I'll go without champagne, but I'll taste the American domestic sparkling wine producers. So some things go up, some things won't go up. But the idea behind tariffs are not unreasonable. The important thing to remember, and I've said this before, is that all tariffs are taxes on imports. Every single thing in this world that moves is taxed by government. Governments tax wages, governments tax social security, governments tax profits, governments tax dividends, government tax sodas, government tax cigarettes, governments tax property, anything at all, and governments slap a tax on them. And in many cases, those taxes are quite painful because it's your labor that's being stolen. And so income taxes, which I think seems to be a fairly dubious as a concept, because you're hired to do whatever work you're doing, and the government just simply takes a chunk of your labor and says, I'll have that. And that's it. And you don't have any means of rejecting this, because if you do, you will end up in prison. So it's quite a harsh tax on your wages. You go to prison if you don't pay it. with imports, if you tax imports, you don't have to pay it. You say, okay, well, I'm not going to buy this product. I'll buy the domestic product. You always have a choice of where you're going to spend your money. So it seems to be far less dubious and far less coercive than other taxes. And again, as I say, other taxes seem very, very dubious. I mean, income tax, and that's a relatively new invention, precisely because there's real questions involved. I mean, where does the government get off essentially taking your labor? Up to 50% of your labor is just taken by government, and says, well, you better cough up this money, or you want to go to prison. So with these import taxes, I mean, I think it's much more reasonable. And keep in mind, before the income tax, that's how governments collected most of their revenue. I'm not saying that like it can be done now. Governments couldn't collect all of their revenue now from imposing taxes on imports, but that's only because government has become so bloated. So I don't get. I think there's a lot of hysteria, as per usual, about import taxes. And a lot of it is driven by corporations that they don't like this very much, and they, when they don't like something, the media invariably repeat this on all the editorial pages, that this is something so monstrous and horrific, and so on. The very same media, they never question the appropriateness of income taxes. I mean, why is that appropriate, but not taxes on imports? So we'll have to see how it plays out. So I wouldn't panic too much at this stage. And stock markets, they go up and down. I mean, that's the nature of the beast. I mean, they're always very nervous, these people. There was panicking, and they would start dumping their stock, and then when they realize that things aren't as bad as they thought, then they start buying the stock back. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But I don't see in principle anything at all problematic about tariffs. And if other countries want to impose their tariffs, let them protect their own farmers or whoever. I think all governments should try to protect their own domestic producers. Why wouldn't they? You want your people to be working rather than out of work. How does that benefit anyone to have your people out of work? Governments will still have to pay for that. Somebody's going to have to pay for out of work individuals. Or somebody's going to have to pay them an unemployment benefit. Someone is going to have to pay for their health care. Someone's going to have to pay for their housing. So it still adds up to a government cost. Whereas with tariffs, people are gainfully employed. So that's why I don't have any problem with that. Brian T1 says, hello, George. Thought you and Peter had a great conversation yesterday. Thank you very much, Brian. Really appreciate that. And then Mark's says 2023 says Russia's sending the ball back to Trump's court. Yeah, I think that's well put. I think that is, yeah, for all the cliche of the last 48 hours, the ball is in Russia's court. Russia's was saying, well, no, the ball is now in the Americans' court. The Russians, I think, reasonably say, as you've made us an offer. That offer isn't appropriate for us. However, we're not rejecting it out of hand. I mean, Trump says, well, I'm the art of the deal. Okay, the art of the deal, you present an offer. And you say, well, I'm afraid that offer won't suffice. However, we're not outright rejecting it. We're going back to you and say we need certain changes. And then you say, why do we want changes? Because as things stand, you're just going to use this time to gain unilateral advantages over us, and obviously we can't allow that. So we'll have to see whether how Trump responds to that. I think it's Russia's position, as I read out from what Putin said at the news conference. I think it's very reasonable, and we'll see how Trump responds to that. He may, of course, just get angry and impose sanctions against Russia. I don't think he's going to do that. I think he's going to continue negotiating. I think that's he'll see that Russians have made a reasonable criticism of this offer. They haven't rejected it, but they've made their concerns known, and so I think that the negotiations will continue. And of course, during this time, as the negotiations continue, if indeed Putin is right and that the Ukrainian forces in Kursk are on the brink of collapse, then Russia could use this time just to finish off the Ukrainians in Kursk. So then that problem, that impediment to the ceasefire agreement, Russia could get it out of the way, because this is going backwards, and this is going to go back and forth. I mean, Witkoff is in Moscow, so presumably he'll have his conversation with Putin, and then Witkoff will go back to Washington, relay Putin's message to Trump, and then Trump would then have to respond to that and come up with some new offer. So that gives a certain amount of time, and I hope Russia will use that time well. In other words, just finish the job off in Kursk, at least. Just get that out of the way, and then that impediment to a ceasefire will have evaporated. So we'll, but we'll see. I mean, I think this is going to go on for a while. This talk about a ceasefire. So it's at least another couple of weeks. So the French, who were saying, "Oh, well, there'll be a ceasefire declared within, by today, sometime today," and it's absolute nonsense. So this is clearly, so their plans to send in their peacekeepers is going to have to be delayed somewhat. But again, that's just it's the Russians are never going to accept that. I mean, they just can't accept these essentially NATO forces in Ukraine building their NATO infrastructure in Ukraine. It's just not on. Robert, always good to see you, Robert. Foucault, so Robert says Foucault explained that Napoleon designated himself as emperor to signal that he was restoring the Roman Empire. Yeah, I think that's right. I think it was, and that was always thought to be rather progressive. And the French brought all that during the French Revolution. They did bring back the whole Romans and everything. The way they started counting the years and everything. So it was very much in the spirit of Rome. But of course, the French revolutionaries was thinking about the Republic, the Roman Republic, rather than the Roman Empire. For Napoleon, the French Revolution got rid of an illegitimate monarchy which had its origins in the overthrow of the Roman Empire. This restoration was embodied in the embrace of classical Roman architecture in Western capitals and all over Europe, as well as the U.S. I think that's right, and I think there was a lot of that, that kind of building in you see it everywhere in Paris. That that classical Roman architecture that was encouraged by Napoleon. That whole Haussmann, the buildings designed by Haussmann. And so you absolutely see it there. I think that's right, and that's why he did this the empire thing. And I don't know whether he was particularly upset that that Beethoven rescinded the dedication of the Eroica. I mean, anyone else would be upset, that somehow if you have Beethoven dedicating a symphony to you, and now you don't. But he as the he ultimately failed in his project, and he failed again through his vanity. And I think as the book that's the book the Gaggle book club for this week points out, and it's posted on the Gaggle local site. So please, everybody, join our locals community, because we post a book club every week. And not only is it a book club, we actually post the PDF version of the book. So you join our locals community and you get a free PDF of a very good book. But anyway, what we had was Dominic Leven's account of Russia against Napoleon. And I think what was important there is that you know it was the beginning of the end. Russia, spelled the beginning of the end for Napoleon. There was not, and as he pointed out, the always the way it's presented by historians is somehow, oh, Napoleon was defeated by the Russian winter. He was defeated by the huge landmass of Russia, Russia's scorched earth tactics, and so on. But as Leven points out, it was actually Russia that fought with great skill and brilliant strategy, and that ultimately destroyed Napoleon and destroyed his Grande Armée, which actually spelled doom for Napoleon. But according to Leven, even then, Napoleon could, in theory, have recovered after the 1812 debacle. But in fact, it was the Russians kept pressing forward in 1813 and 1814, inflicting one defeat after another on Napoleon. It was brilliant Russian generals and brilliant Russian statecraft and military tactics that spelled the final denouement for Napoleon. Then Tsar Alexander I marched into Paris in 1814. But yeah, Napoleon, the memory of a great man, and it was kind of an interesting thing, which was that in the 19th century, I mean, of course, he was a very unpopular figure towards the end of his life, and so all the European powers ganged up on him and decided they needed to get rid of him. So they first banished him to the Isle of Elba, from which he escaped and returned to France to lead them one more time, and then they banished him to the Isle of Saint Helena. But what's interesting was that, however much that they wanted to get rid of Napoleon in 1814, 1815, he kind of obsessed everyone for the next 100 years. I mean, the 19th century literature was dominated by the figure of Napoleon. I mean, the preoccupation of the great man, and the preoccupation of the sort of the romantic movement, and the impact of the great man on history, and so on. So it was an interesting sort of figure that, on the one hand, they wanted Napoleon out, but it just became the preoccupation of 19th century art and literature. Anyway, thank you, Robert. And then Ivan Grozny says, so George, prediction time once again. What do you think Trump's response to Putin will be in terms of a likely ceasefire, or will there even be one? I think they're going to take it seriously. I think I can't predict whether they'll agree to anything, but I think Trump will take it seriously. Putin has now said, okay, in principle, we agree with you. Yeah, not a bad idea, the ceasefire, but there has to be preconditions. And I think Trump will take it seriously, and will try to address Putin's concerns. I don't think, to be honest, a stoppage on arms deliveries or intelligence during the period of a ceasefire is such a huge sacrifice for Trump to make. If he's serious, if he really wants to bring this war to an end, then I think that's a reasonable request on the part of the Russians, and I think Trump will see it as a reasonable request. I don't think Putin, and there's nothing here in what Putin said during this news conference which would be not doable. I mean, so people say, "Oh, Putin's deliberately sabotaging it." If Putin really wanted to sabotage this, he could easily make demands that Trump would not be able to meet. I mean, for instance, if Putin was like, "Well, okay, we want sanctions lifted, or we want the frozen assets given back to us." Now, if Putin were to ask that, I mean, I don't think that could be delivered. I mean, that's something that can be discussed in the final settlement negotiations, but not at this stage, which is just simply a ceasefire. The whole purpose of a ceasefire is to use this time not in order to strengthen your hand unilaterally for the resumption of the fighting. The whole point is to use the period to begin negotiations toward the final settlement. So that's why Putin's demands today were not so onerous that Trump couldn't meet them. Yeah, why not? Why not stop arms deliveries for 30 days? And then if really everything in Kursk is collapsing for Ukraine, as Putin claims it is, then Russia should just wrap that up and finish this Kursk thing off, and then the ceasefire becomes manageable. And then again, the point he was saying about who's going to observe the ceasefire, he said, well, that is something that could easily be negotiated. Obviously, not the Europeans. I mean, if the British and the French say, yeah, we will observe the ceasefire, well, that's obviously not acceptable. Russia will not accept the British and French as in any way objective observers. But it wouldn't be that difficult to put together a team of observers that should be acceptable. I mean, why can't you have Indians and Nigerians and Chinese and anyone from from countries that don't have a dog in this fight, and say that they will be the observers. So again, that's doable. So all the talk about how Putin is determined to say no. If he were, he would make a lot of unreasonable demands, or at least demands that Trump would say no to. So nothing that Putin said today is inherently impossible for Trump to meet. Yeah. So I don't know whether the ceasefire will take place. I really don't know. I think Trump will take it seriously. I think Witkoff will return to Washington with a message from Putin, and I think that they will continue discussing this. Now, of course, the media will be doing what the media do. They'll be screaming, "Oh, Trump is playing patty cake with Putin. Trump is, being, trying to negotiate with Putin above the heads of the Europeans. He's talking to Putin above the heads of Ukraine and whatever." Trump, I don't think Trump cares about that. I mean, but I think he will take it seriously. I don't think he's just going to say, "Well, that's it. Putin has rejected my very generous offer. Therefore, I'm going to start tightening the sanctions." I don't think that's what's going to happen. So, but will it come to the 30-day ceasefire? I think I can't tell now. But I think it's significant that that Putin did not put forward anything that's a deal breaker. He could easily have presented, if Putin really wanted to make sure that there was no ceasefire, he could easily present demands that would be deal breakers. So he didn't do that. So Marx 2023 says Trump just threatened the EU with 200% tariffs on wine and champagne unless the EU withdraw announced tariff on American whiskey. It's no more than soap opera. Yeah, but it's quite entertaining. And so it's really funny because I didn't really realize that there was any particular demand for American whiskey in Europe. Whiskey is certainly drunk in Europe, but it's usually Scotch that's drunk. I mean, American whiskey is an acquired taste. I'm not a huge bourbon fan. I'm not a huge American whiskey fan. Uh, it's I mean, if you like that sort of thing, that's fine. But I don't know that Europeans particularly um, care for that as opposed to the Scotch. I think, which I think that's a classy drink. But even Japanese whiskey, I think is much superior to American whiskey. But yeah, I think this is going to go on for a while. This whole tariffing one another. But I imagine at some point this will be settled. I think they're going to get around the table and settle this. So I think it's just this is this is for show. But I think eventually there will be some agreement on this. But I agree with you, Mark, that there's a soap opera quality to it. Trump always got the champagne thing is always bringing that one up. Um, he did that before in his first term, but he's going to hit champagne, and then somehow it's great for our domestic sparkling wine producers. I guess he still says domestic champagne producers, but in theory, we shouldn't call it champagne because, of course, you can only call something champagne if it comes from Champagne. But everyone always cheats about that, and particularly the Americans who call their sparkling wine champagne. Anyway, Brian says if Trump claims that this war would never have started if he was in office, then he must already know why it did start. Well, he I don't know. I mean, because if you were to ask me, and I imagine you, but I don't know, I can't speak for you. But if you were to ask me, well, how did this war start? Then we'd say, well, it started because of inexorable NATO expansion and the plan to induct Ukraine into NATO, all done in the teeth of Russian objections. Now, Trump himself, during his time in office, had done nothing to thwart NATO expansion. NATO continued expanding during Trump time. Macedonia, now it's called North Macedonia, North Macedonia and Montenegro were inducted into NATO during the Trump years. And as we've already discussed earlier, Trump delivered these lethal weapons to Ukraine. Now, which I think all of these events helped fuel this war. Why? What were the reasons why Russia launched this war? Now, does Trump think that? I'm not sure. I think Trump, when he says this war would never have started if I were in office, what he means is that Well, that's a good. What does he mean? He says different things. He has said yes, it was the attempt to push Ukraine into NATO, but at other times it's more that Biden was so weak, and particularly his ineffectual, feeble withdrawal from Afghanistan in the when was it, in the summer of 2021, that somehow that encouraged Putin to invade Ukraine. That's the way Trump explains it. And in fact, Trump many times has said that, well, when I was president, uh, Putin, I could see that Ukraine was the apple of his eye, and I knew he wanted to get his hands on Ukraine. And I said to him, he said this. Trump has said this story many times. I said to him, Vladimir, don't you do it. Don't you do it, otherwise, we're going to hit you in a way, in devastating ways that you don't even dream of. He said this is Trump has claimed this. So he has, to be sure, he said yes, he said things that we might be in agreement with, which was the insistence to get Ukraine into NATO, which was the trigger for the Russian attack. But he's also said that it wouldn't have happened if I were president, because I'm so tough and I'm so terrifying in my in my mercurial, unpredictable temperament, that Putin wouldn't have dared to do this if I were president. So he's kind of had it both ways. He said both things. So when you say that he must already know why it did start, well, he's presented both sides as to why it started. He must also be aware of the Minsk agreement. I would imagine he's only hazily aware. Probably it has been explained to him um, about. You remember, even in that meeting with Zelensky, he kind of, when Zelensky talked about 2014, and then the Russia taking. Russia invading Ukraine in 2014, and then Trump said, "No, the 2015," and then he had to be corrected by J.D. Vance. So it was 2014. So I don't know to what extent he's fully aware of the Minsk agreements. Anyway, so Brian goes on. Russia's been quite clear for some time regarding security issues. Yes, they have. Trump must have an understanding of the Russian position. Well, I think it's what you said is absolutely right. He has it. Occasionally, he does indeed show that he has a good understanding of what the Russia's concerns are, and that's why, from the Russian perspective, um, Trump is really the best they can hope for. There isn't really anyone on the horizon who would be as sympathetic to the Russian position as Trump is. So that's why the Putin obviously thinks it's important to maintain good relations with Trump, not to show any discourtesy towards Trump. And when I read this out, what he was saying, well, we really appreciate, Trump's, and then he referred to our American partners and colleagues. That's a very warm embrace of the Americans. So I think Trump does understand that Russia has security concerns, and probably if Trump was not under considerable domestic constraints, he could probably work something out with Putin on Ukraine that would be not unfavorable to Russia's position. But he is under domestic constraints. I mean, you've got to keep in mind that he is president, but he's still in a minority on this issue of Ukraine. I mean, he has some supporters among the Republicans, but he has all of the Democrats against him. He has all of the media against him. He has the entire kind of military security establishment in Washington against him, and he has the whole NATO European apparat against him. So he has to kind of consider all of that, um, in his attempt to. And so, I mean, the idea people say, "Oh, it's not his war; it's Biden's war." Well, first of all, it is his war, and he even acknowledges that it is his war. He played an important role in this war. The actions that he took during his first term, played an important role. But okay, the worst didn't come under his administration; it came under Biden's. But even if you accept that and say yes, it's Biden's war, it's not Trump's war, it's not that easy to get yourself out of a war. It's very tricky because there's a lot of powerful interests that want to maintain a war, and you don't want to be the president who made America look weak, who made NATO look weak. As I said before, Trump has no intention of leaving NATO. Trump has no intention of undermining NATO. So he doesn't want to do anything that would make NATO look weak. So the argument, oh, it's Biden's war, it's not Trump's war, therefore Trump can do anything he likes, it's not going to fly for the same reason that the people who said to Nixon in 1969, January 1969, hey, this is Kennedy and Johnson's war. It's not Nixon's war. That didn't cut any ice either, because ultimately Nixon had to act in a way to maintain America's power and prestige, and Trump has to do that as well. Trump is the steward of American power and prestige. It's not going to do anything that makes America look weak. So that's why I think Trump may have an understanding of Russia's position, or at least at various times he has shown that he has an understanding of that. But it's not going to be easy. He still has to maneuver his way around this the cesspool of the American political and security and military establishment, as Putin does as well. So, well, as Trump would say, we'll see what happens. Okay. Yeah. Anyway. Mark says, what are you talking about, George? The Europeans are doing what Trump wants. Yeah, they're doing what Trump wants. I think that's exactly what I said. They're spending a lot more money on their military. And, it's a great public relations exercise that the Europeans have pulled off, that somehow they're persuading their public that by increasing their military expenditures, massively increasing, with money that they don't have, they are sticking a thumb in Trump's eye. That's actually quite a clever maneuver, so that people will sign on, all the sort of Annalena Baerbock types and all the Greens and all the leftish progressive types who hate Trump, and you tell them, hey, we need to spend a lot more on our military. I know you would like to spend this money on welfare programs or whatever, but we have to do it on the military because, hey, we got to stick it to Trump. And all right, we'll send money. We're going to stick it to Trump. But of course, they're not sticking it to Trump. They're doing exactly what Trump wants them to do. Trump has been badgering them ever since 2017. The Europeans have to spend more on their military. Now they're doing it. He's got what he wanted. He got the Europeans to spend a lot more on their military. I mean, they may present it as if somehow we're sticking it to Trump, but they're doing what Trump wanted them to do. Marx 2020 said Russia needs Stalin. All the elites would be parked 6 feet under. Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I think that the Stalin years were without question terrible years. The losses that the Russians and all of the Soviet people suffered under Stalin. There's no question, but by any kind of historical measure, the historians would say, well, the Soviet Union was infinitely stronger when Stalin died than it was when Stalin came to power. Stalin was very weak. The Soviet Union was weak, vulnerable, divided and confused leadership among the Bolsheviks. Vulnerable to attack from all corners in 1925-26. He leaves it in 1953, occupying half of Europe and terrifying the other half. That's not a bad accomplishment. And having seen off the worst threat that Russia had faced in its history from the Wehrmacht. So, everything one can say about the terrible things that happened during Stalin's period, all the terrible losses in life. I think history will then will always be quite not unsympathetic to him. Where I think history will be very cruel to Gorbachev and Yeltsin. It's like, because the measure of any political leader, what was your country like when you came to power? How was it when you left? If it's much weaker when you left, then you've obviously been a disastrous leader. If it's much stronger when you left, then you've been a good leader. So, Richard Phillips says, I've been totally convinced that the American peace plan is theater. Why? Because they want Europe to buy their weapons. I agree. Even pressurizing Europe to spend more money on the military. Yes. The recent ridiculous attempt at ceasefire backs up my theory. Well, I think it's too early to say about that the ceasefire attempt is ridiculous. I think we'll have to see how that plays out. I think it is a serious offer. I think the Russians are taking it seriously, but that doesn't mean that it's going to happen. But the rest, I think I agree. I mean, Trump has succeeded in getting the Europeans to spend a lot more money on their military. And this love fest, you should have watched it today in the Oval Office between Mark Rutte and Trump, which shows, well, no, I mean, Europe and America are basically on the same page. And Rutte is the quintessential European, longtime Prime Minister of Holland, and he couldn't stop singing the praises of Trump and all that he has accomplished, how much money he was talking about how much money you have brought into NATO. He said something like 700 billion or whatever it was. It was an amazing sum. So this really was theater. This whole Punch and Judy show of the Americans and the Europeans. It's classic Punch and Judy. First Punch bashes Judy, then Judy bashes Punch, and then kiss kiss, love. They've been the Americans and the Europeans have been playing this Punch and Judy show for years. We shouldn't, I think it's shameful that people keep falling for it. And then Richard Phillips says he doesn't make sense that the USA is saying spend more money on the military, but we also want peace. No, at the same time, yeah. I mean, I kind of agree. There's always that issue with Trump, which is that he wants to be, I'm the peace candidate, but at the same time, I want to expand American power. So it's always this, with Trump, it's why he confuses his opponents in the way he does, because I'm the peace candidate. Well, how is he the peace candidate when he unconditionally supports Israel in the Middle East? How is he the peace candidate if he threatens Iran? How is he the peace candidate when he threatens China? Now, Ukraine is a little bit of an anomaly because there I think he wants peace. But nonetheless, he's succeeded in persuading the public that he's somehow for peace, even though everything he has done has actually advanced war. Yes, he didn't start any new wars um, during his years in office, but he didn't. He never withdrew any forces from anywhere. He didn't withdraw from Syria. He didn't withdraw from Afghanistan. Um, he risked war with Iran by assassinating General Soleimani. He bombed Syria twice, um, and did everything that Israel demanded. So he was not exactly, you know, the peace candidate, but he's a good politician, and a good politician he manages to persuade the public that you're one thing, even though your actions are the exact opposite. So, so that's that. He's done this very well. But I think Ukraine is the one area I think he does want to end this. I think he does see this as a pointless war. Because I think at this stage he thinks Russia is more useful to America as a friend than as an adversary. I don't think he takes Russia very seriously. I don't think he thinks particularly highly of Russia, but he still doesn't think it's worthwhile to continue with this war against Russia. Anyway, then we have, and Robert says, thank you, Robert, as always. Thank you for your generosity. And then Robert says, Louis Vuitton and Hermes are examples of Veblen goods, the Thorstein Veblen's goods, where the higher the price, the greater the demand. I agree. I absolutely agree. The higher the price, the greater the demand. Yeah. Veblen already by the late 19th century realized that the status a purchase conferred had come to predominate over the utility it had to offer in capitalist society. No, that's absolutely right. It is a matter of the status of a product and the high price that the product the product demands. The high price actually confers a certain status on the product and therefore encourages the purchase of the product, even though it's not of any particularly high quality. Um, and incidentally, Trump himself has made use of that. I mean, the stuff that he has produced over the years was always extremely expensive, and he managed to persuade people to spend this money, even though there was nothing special about the quality of the product. Like he had Trump vodka. At some point that Trump vodka vanished. But Trump vodka, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe Trump vodka still exists. But Trump vodka was extremely expensive. When he began marketing his vodka brand, he marketed it right away as being much, much more expensive than the usual brands of vodka on the shelves. Like Absolut, Finlandia. Those vodkas, those Absolut and Finlandia, were actually of a higher quality than Trump vodka. But people would buy Trump vodka because of the price. And I think that's exactly the thing. But Louis Vuitton, there's nothing absolutely special about Louis Vuitton. Absolutely nothing. But it is the status that women want to be seen with Louis Vuitton bags and Hermes bags, and are ready to pay these astronomical sums, even though there's nothing about it that they're suggesting this high quality. I mean, Louis Vuitton has this huge store on Fifth Avenue, always crowded, and because it persuades people to spend more because of the brand. Though there's no nothing special about the quality, and so it is an extraordinary aspect of the capitalist societies. You normally think, well, it's the product that's good quality at a low price. That's the one that's going to win out on the market. But no, you can do it. Poor quality and an extraordinary price that can win out. So if you can persuade the public that this is a valuable possession, that brand is a valuable commodity. Um, uh, so, um, so then we have all right. We have Richard Phillips says, keep up the realism talking points, although I can see you're getting a lot of heat for it from the people emotionally invested in Russia. Thank you, Richard. That's it's very kind of you to say so. I am getting a lot of heat on that. And I think it's a little unfair because, all my sympathies are with Russia and have been for some time. But the attacks I'm getting somehow I'm questioning the inevitable, magnificent triumph of Russia. And I don't particularly want to question it, but my view is just simply, well, you got to do it. You have to actually deliver. You have to win a war. Don't just keep saying, "Oh, we're winning." Oh, and at some point we're going to do this, this, and this. We're going to march into Kiev, and then we're going to force Brussels to capitulate, and whatever. I mean, it's that's just childish, and that's but because I call that into question, I get a lot of heat for it, and I just ultimately when I say realism, you have to deliver. You basically you can't do the it's your actions that do the talking for you. The reason Israel has been as successful, I mean, obviously it's very good at public relations and has America, but ultimately it's because um, it it succeeds. It succeeds militarily, and you can't argue with that. I mean, Israel can spend its time arguing about the justness of its cause. No one would pay any attention. The Palestinians talk about the justness of their cause, and they can talk about what happened in 1948 and what happened in 1967 and so on. Very good arguments. And plenty of people have presented their arguments very well. Noam Chomsky has presented those arguments very eloquently and very in a very scholarly way. But it doesn't cut any ice unless you can actually back that up with military victories. And so that's the difference between Israel and the Palestinians, which is Israel wins its wars and does whatever is necessary to win the wars. And it doesn't present itself as too good for this world, but it just goes ahead and wins these wars. But somehow, because I kind of think, hey, you stop talking about how you're winning, actually do it, and then get it out of the way. I get all these attacks, but okay, that's free debate. It's one of those things. But anyway, thank you so much, Richard. And Richard says, I'm not sure you're right that posh people will drink sparkling wine instead of champagne. Well, I get that. I mean, you're right. I mean, that goes back to what we were just talking about a moment ago. Champagne has that name, and champagne is high quality stuff. I mean, there's no question. I mean, you can drink sparkling wine, and you drink champagne, and you say that's the real thing. It's of an infinitely higher quality than sparkling wine from America, from Spain, or Germany, or anywhere else. I mean, that when you taste the real thing, that's the real thing. So so that it doesn't quite the Louis Vuitton thing. I basically that's just the brand. There's nothing special about it. Champagne is the brand, but it is high quality stuff. And I think you're probably right that uh, people who buy champagne, I mean, champagne isn't cheap. That's just, it's never been cheap. So it's that's never going to be um, something that is affordable. So therefore, people who are ready to spend that kind of money on champagne will go on spending it, even though champagne will be far more expensive. But and yeah, you're probably right that if you are in the business of drinking champagne, you're not going to switch over to American sparkling wine. I mean, you just can't, because hey, this is the real thing. American sparkling wine is not the real thing. So you're probably right. The tariffs are not going to help the sparkling wine producers, but they might help um, American domestic wine producers. The Americans do produce good domestic wines, even if they can't compete with champagne. I mean, they're good. American wines are pretty good, so it probably will help domestic wine producers, not the sparkling wine producers. Um, and then Richard says tariffs can be useful to grow a certain industry, but applying them randomly is a bit silly. I agree with that. I mean, that's the only reason we should have tariffs, which is to protect your domestic producers, not in order to get yourself into fights with everyone around the world. Um, Mark says George, America has the largest trade deficit in its history. It does not have domestic producers for the majority of consumer goods. America is the world's largest consumer importer. There's no investment by industrialists. America is a service economy that's been financialized. Well, I mean, first of all, any dominant economy inevitably runs a trade deficit because that's the way it maintains its dominance around the world, because it has the reserve. Its currency is the reserve currency. The British did the same thing when the sterling, the pound sterling, was the world's reserve currency. The British also ran a massive trade deficit. However, trade deficit is exactly what Trump wants to get away from. I mean, that's the Trump goal, which is that as a result of the trade deficit, America is shipping jobs overseas. Manufacturers are moving their factories from the United States, they're moving them to other countries, and then those products are imported into the United States. So essentially, jobs are being exported abroad. So when you run a trade deficit, you're exporting your jobs. It's a highly undesirable state of affairs, and that's what Trump is trying to rectify. I mean, maybe Trump will fail, but I think it's important to get away from that. I mean, America was once the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. Um, Turn of the 20th century, and then after World War II, all the way through, really through to the 1980s, even through the Reagan era, it was still America was a manufacturing powerhouse. And Trump wants to get back to that. I mean, again, maybe it will fail, whatever. But I think everyone should try to do that. I think it's a responsible leadership should be in the business of encouraging production. You want to produce something. You don't just want to play around with money. And I think that's a very admirable thing to do. Yeah, you want to have your auto industry, you want to have your aerospace industry, you want to have your computer industry, you want to have your Silicon Valley. You want to be at the cutting edge of every industry. I mean, that's the ideal. I'm not saying that can be done, but you don't want to be in the business of running huge trade deficits, because essentially then you are financializing the economy. Jobs are being shipped overseas, and then the capital flows back into the country, and then that means it's capital in the hands of Wall Street, or it's capital in the hands of stockholders who just simply buy it up in order to boost their stocks and therefore boost their fake income. So undesirable, and I think it's good that Trump ran on the platform of trying to end that. But we'll see, whether he succeeds. But I don't have a problem with somebody wanting to end that. And then Brian, thank you very much, Brian. Very generous of you. Brian says, over the past few days, I've listened to a number of podcasts speculating about what Russia will do, but the Gaggle always comes up with opinions that nobody else thinks of. Well, thank you so much, Brian. Really appreciate that. Thank you. Appreciate it. And thank you for your generous tip. The dogs will devour that. But thank you. And then Robert says prohibition had a lot of support, but had to wait until a substitute for spirit taxes could be found. Once federal income tax legislation was passed in 1913, prohibition became doable, imposed as the Volstead Act of 1919. Yeah. That's right. I think a substitute for spirits taxes could be found once federal income tax legislation was passed in 1913. Prohibition became doable, and I think it's a very good point. That's prohibition, and prohibition was clearly not a great idea, but it was certainly very popular. I mean, they managed to get a constitutional amendment. I mean, that took some doing to get a constitutional amendment for the prohibition, and as I say, I mean, I don't think it's realistic to end the income tax, but income taxes, I think, are much more dubious than import taxes. I think import taxes are perfectly reasonable, far less coercive. I think just income taxes are just terrible. I mean, the whole idea that half of your labor is stolen by government, and if you if you do anything to stop this, you end in prison. I mean, it's I mean, that, if anything, is a tyranny of government, and people that just accept it. No one protests about it. Well, because there's nothing you can do about it. But the notion that somehow that's fine and no one has any problem with it. But heaven forbid you impose a tax on luxury goods coming into the country, and then suddenly the media are in meltdown. It's just ridiculous. And then Mark says, I enjoyed the spat between George and Peter. George is taking big risks. Peter is backed up with that angry mob of hungry dogs. You're right. I'm taking a risk. Those dogs, they are hungry. There are 4 of them. They have no loyalty to me. They have no fondness for me. They blame me for everything. So absolutely, it's just those dogs can be, once they're unleashed against me, I don't have any real means of defending myself. Thank you, Marks. And then Brian says, "Not sure it was a spat, but it was colorful." No, I think it was. I think it was an exchange of ideas, and I think we came to through a debate. I think we arrived at what I think is going to happen. I think that, and I think we can see that it's already happening. Is that the Russians will say that, well, this is a good idea in principle, this the 30-day ceasefire, but we need some of our interests taken care of. We can't just simply sign off on a ceasefire while you continue to send arms and intelligence to Ukraine. I mean, we'd be stupid to agree to that. And Trump, as a deal maker, will have to say, yeah. I mean, he's used to negotiating. He can make an initial offer, but that doesn't mean that whomever he's negotiating with is obligated to accept that offer. He's going to present an offer of his own. So yeah. Anne Marie, good to see you, Anne Marie. Thank you so much, Anne Marie, for your generosity. Appreciate you. I don't know. I don't know if you've had a chance, Anne Marie, to make a comment on the Beethoven late quartet that I posted in the music club. I'd be very interested to hear your comment about that. I'm not even sure that the string quartet Op 135 was necessarily Beethoven's best of his late quartets. I thought it was his most accessible, Um, but I'm not sure it was his best. But anyway, I'd be really interested, Anne Marie, to read any comments that you may have about that. But thank you, Anne Marie, for your generosity. Um, and and then anyway, so thank you, Brian, and thank you for your kind words. Appreciate it. Um, and And then Robert says Sputnik had an interesting article about Albert Kahn and the construction of heavy machinery plants in Donetsk and Kharkov in the 1920s. Could you say what Stalin's role was in this? Well, um, that was in the time when the, um, the Bolsheviks were very impressed with American organization, American factories, and American know-how, and Stalin shared that. So the 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 Bolsheviks obviously regarded the Americans as the capitalist enemy, but they were very impressed with mass production. They were very impressed with the American factory organization, with those plants, particularly machine tools, and really the rapid industrialization, and particularly the scale of the industrialization, the scale of the production that the Americans achieved was, in, impressed the Bolsheviks no end, and they kind of wanted to emulate that. So these Bolsheviks were in the United States trying to learn exactly how the Americans pulled this off. So even then, they were already impressed by the Americans rather than the British. The British, the Bolsheviks just suspected the British, disliked the British, and always attributed rightly the most malign of motives to the British. But the Americans, they were always very impressed by, and that was always true about Stalin. So I think his role in this was precisely that they wanted to emulate in the Soviet Union, very really from the very earliest days, the American organization, American factory production, American machinery plants, all of that. They wanted to import that into the Soviet Union, and Stalin was very much into all of that. Um, so yeah, that I think it was Stalin's role in it, and the Soviets did do that. I mean, they did build. They copied the Americans precisely in the fact that these factories and these machine plants were on a gigantic scale. This is what they did. It's like they wanted to do what the Americans did. Now, of course, they didn't do it. They were nowhere near as good as the Americans were. I mean, they couldn't organize their factories as well, and they had a lot of accidents, and they did, it was awful, awful. They made awful mistakes in doing so, but they wanted to copy the Americans. Um, what's interesting about that is maybe we can talk about it some other time. Is that the Soviets really had very little time for the way Mao conducted his industrialization, because they felt that Mao did not follow that path, not trying to do in a scientific, organized way that the Bolsheviks had done it. The Bolsheviks tried to do it the American way, and they thought that's the way you do industrialization. Mao did it in a very haphazard way. He refused to take instructions from the Soviets, and so he had these little plants. Remember those scenes of these steel furnaces. These peasants having steel furnaces in their in their backyard. And so that was the way the Chinese did it. It was an absolute fiasco. But the Soviets, they tried to do it like the Americans did it. Um, and Where are we? but Robert, I mean, if you have, I didn't see this article in Sputnik. I really would be very interested in reading this article. So if you have a link, that would be really nice. Um, so and then Brian asked, is the Trump administration placing additional sanctions on Russian energy and banks? I don't know. It's very interesting that that because the issue came up today during Trump's news conference, whether what leverage do you have with Putin and so on, and Trump said, well, I have leverage, but I don't really want to do that. And I think people said, well, would you impose sanctions on Russia if they don't go along with it? And, the usual, questions, because everything is always, Russia's to blame for everything and so on. And Trump's view was that, now is not the time to talk about that. If things fall, if things fail, if things fall flat, then maybe we can talk about it. But now is not the time to talk about it. So I think he would hold off on the sanctions at least while negotiations about the ceasefire take place. I think he's going to hold off on that. I'd be surprised if he pushed for sanctions now, because if he pushed for sanctions now, then there would be no incentive at all for Putin to entertain the ceasefire proposal. And I'm assuming Trump, he's put his reputation on the line on this ceasefire. He would like that ceasefire to be taken seriously. So I'd be surprised if he's going to impose any additional sanctions now. I mean, he might do it later, but I'd be surprised he'd do it now. Anne-Marie says, I'm sorry for my late comment on Beethoven. It's a moment ago. I did it a moment ago. Okay, good. I'm really looking forward to reading it after this. Thank you. Thank you, Anne-Marie. I'm sure it's really interesting and insightful. Mark, thanks you so much. Really appreciate that. And then Brian, to you well. Brian says, thank you for all your thoughts, George. You're a wealth of information. Thank you so much, Brian. Really appreciate those very kind words. And Brian says, oh, this is an Institute for Global Policy International Conference, March 23rd, 2024. Oh, that was a year ago, yeah. Oh, I'll be in Belgrade again in May. So I'm going to be speaking again at a conference in May. Hope to have that featured on the locals page. And so we can talk about that afterwards, do the the post match analysis about my talk in Belgrade. That's going to be towards the end of May, so that should be fun. Look forward to seeing what the Gagglers thought of it, and whether they're still going to be berating me then as much as they are now. But anyway, thank you so much, Brian. All right, my time I think is up. So thank you everybody who joined me. Thank you for all of your kind words, especially some very nice words today. Thank you. Thank you also for the those who put something into the tip jar. Thank you. I'm thanking you. The dogs are they're very difficult to deal with. I mean, they just don't. They don't understand this rational discourse that we engage in. They're on a different level altogether. But anyway, thank you. We're going to do some more podcasts over the weekend, and then next Monday we're going to do the live stream with Peter. And then Brian says, "Have that one bookmark." Thank you, Brian. So we do the live stream with Peter on Monday, and then I'm back on with the solo on Tuesday. So thank you for tonight. We'll see what happens in the next few days. Very, very interesting. So thank you. Good night. See you very soon. All the best. Bye-bye.